80 years ago, an American journalist embarked on a mission to save the lives of strangers. He was Varian Fry, sometimes called the American Schindler. This is the story of that hero. But first, some history. The Nazis invaded France on the 10th of May 1940, and by the 14th of June, Hitler's forces entered a largely deserted Paris. Over 2 million Parisians had fled south. A week later, the French signed an armistice. France had fallen. France was divided in two. The Nazis occupied northern France, while the French Vichy puppet government ruled the south. This was the era of surrender on demand. Article 19 of the Armistice Agreement required the Vichy regime to hand over any person that the Germans demanded without any prior notice. Surrender on demand made it painfully clear that once a person was handed over to the Germans, his or her chances of coming back were virtually nil. The Nazi occupation of France targeted artists and intellectuals, many of whom were seen as subversives, communists, degenerates, or Jews. While some, like Matisse and Picasso, chose to remain in France, trusting maybe that their fame would preserve them, most, many of whom were French or immigrant German and Russian Jews, were not safe and needed to get out. Back in the USA, on the 27th of June 1940, American journalist Varian Fry had written to Eleanor Roosevelt, "What is urgently needed now is a new Scarlet Pimpernel who will go to France and risk his life, perhaps many times over, in an attempt to find the intended victims of Hitler's chopping block and either provide them with the means to keep alive in hiding, or if possible, get them out of France before the French authorities reach them. I have volunteered to go myself and shall do so if no more suitable person can be found." So who was this 20th century Scarlet Pimpernel? New York-born, Harvard-educated Varian Fry was in 1940 an editor with the Foreign Policy Association's headline books. He was multilingual, spoke both French and German, and was vehemently anti-fascist. In 1940, he and friends formed the Emergency Rescue Committee to rescue important intellectuals stranded in France, some just a knock on the door from being sent to prison, others already interned. On the 4th of August 1940, Fry boarded a Pan-American flying boat at New York's LaGuardia Airport en route to Marseille in France. He carried a list of 200 of the brightest names in the fields of art, science, literature and medicine who were trapped in Nazi-occupied France, and $3,000 strapped to his belt. These are some of those names. The ones in black are Jews. Varian Fry was about to embark on one of the most dangerous yet least known rescue missions of World War II. Fry was aware of the dangers. In May 1935, he'd taken a business trip to Germany for the Living Age magazine to see for himself the conditions that he'd been hearing about regarding the plight of European Jews. While in Berlin, Fry witnessed the first purges in Germany, the systematic rounding up of Jews by the secret police, and the activities of Hitler's brown shirts, the SA. He saw SA in plain clothes, throwing chairs and tables through the plate glass windows of Jewish-owned cafes, dragging Jewish men and women out of buses and chasing them up the streets, or knocking them down and kicking them in the face and belly as they lay prostrate on the ground. And he heard them chanting their terrible song, "When Jewish blood spurts from the knife, then everything will be fine again." After stops in neutral Portugal and Spain, Fry landed in Marseille, the last French port not yet in Nazi hands. He checked into the Hotel Splendide and then made a visit to the US consulate in Vichy. Fry explained his mission and, much to his surprise, was offered no cooperation at all. Consulate staff had been given strict orders by Breckinridge Long of the State Department to control the numbers of immigrants to the United States. The Vichy government had put pressure on the Americans not to rock the boat. Postpone, postpone, postpone was the order of the day. Returning to Marseille, Fry was left to his own devices and began writing to all those on his 200-name list whose addresses were known. Within hours, word of his arrival was racing through Marseille. The first order of business was to establish a cover for the operation, so Fry went to see the Secretary-General of the Prefecture and spelled out his plans for setting up a centre to aid needy refugees. A few days later, the Centre Américain de Secours opened its doors in an abandoned handbag factory in the Rue Grignon. The only American diplomats in Marseille prepared to help Fry in his work were Vice-Consuls Hiram Bingham IV and Myles Standish. Even before Fry arrived, Bingham and Standish were ignoring State Department instructions, and at the consulate continued to issue visas, travel papers, affidavits in place of passports. This is a visa issued to 19-year-old Jacques Bodner by Henry Bingham in February 1940. Bodner had been interned in Switzerland and then in the French internment camp Les-Milles near Marseille. This visa got him out of the camp, and passenger lists show he sailed to New York from Saint-Nazaire on the 30th of March 1940 on the SS Champlain. In August 1940 there were several ways of getting out of France. From Marseille to Lisbon through the French border town of Bagnoul, to Spain over the Pyrenees along secret routes, with forged papers from Pau in France to Spain and on to Portugal, with questionable passports to Cuba, to Oran in Algeria by boat, or to the French colony of Martinique and onwards via the Dominican Republic to the United States. The flight on the 13th of September 1940 of Alma Mahler and Franz Werfel, Heinrich and Nellie Mann and his nephew Golo was typical of the early escapes. Jewish Austrian Franz Werfel was a novelist, playwright and poet. A journey in 1930 to the Middle East seeing starving refugees inspired his novel The 40 Days of Musa Dag, which drew worldwide attention to the Armenian genocide. Werfel lectured on the subject across Germany. The SS newspaper Das Schwarze Korps denounced him as a propagandist of alleged Turkish horrors perpetrated against the Armenians. Alma Mahler, former wife of both Gustav Mahler and Walter Gropius, was a Viennese-born composer, author, editor and socialite. Married to Jewish Werfel, she was not safe in France. Heinrich Mann was a German novelist whose criticisms of fascism forced him to flee for his life after the Nazis came to power. On the 10th of May 1933, the Nazis had burnt his books as contrary to the German spirit. He fled to France, where he lived in Paris and Nice, and then, during the German occupation, made his way to Marseille. Golo, son of Thomas Mann, had volunteered to join a Czech army unit in France, but was arrested at the border and interned in Camp Les-Milles, where at the beginning of August, Fry had managed to get him released. All had visas, and on September the 12th, 1940, they took a train to the Spanish border. Fry crossed with the luggage, while another rescue committee member crossed the Pyrenees with the group. The climb was hard work for both the 70-year-old Heinrich Mann and the less fit Franz Werfel. Mann and his wife crossed the border with forged Czech passports, but their nephew Golo was recognized as the son of Thomas Mann by the Spanish border guard. Nonetheless, the group received the entry stamp needed to continue by train to Lisbon, where they boarded the Greek steamship Nea Hellas for New York on the 4th of October 1940. Fry also had the help of the Unitarian churches Marta and Waitstill Sharp, who'd come to Lisbon to continue a rescue mission they'd begun in Czechoslovakia. In 1940, transit visas through Spain and Portugal didn't pose a problem, and even the need for French exit visas could safely be ignored. Even before the Nazis invaded France, authorities had ordered European foreigners to report for internment on the grounds that the criminals, spies and anti-government operatives among them had to be weeded out, and beginning in September 1939 the French police had arrested 15,000 national enemies and interned them. In 1940 there were already about 24 internment camps in Vichy, France. Among those in the south were Gurs, Le Vernet, Rivesaltes and Les-Milles. Many of those on Fry's list were interned in such camps. One of these was Leon Feuchtwanger, the son of a Jewish factory owner who'd earned his doctorate before establishing the German magazine Der Spiegel in 1908. Feuchtwanger worked as a critic for a theatre weekly and moved in Munich's bohemian circles, becoming one of Weimar Germany's most prominent critics of Nazism. He wrote the novel Jude Sus in 1925, later reversioned by Goebbels as an anti-Semite rant movie. Nazis burned his home and confiscated his manuscripts while the author lectured in the United States, and all his books were publicly burned in 1933. After the Germans invaded France in 1940, Feuchtwanger was detained first at Camp Les-Milles, then in St. Nicholas near Nîmes. Bingham and Standish planned his escape. Feuchtwanger was dressed in women's clothing and passed through several German checkpoints and was taken to Bingham's villa disguised as Bingham's mother-in-law. There he was reunited with his wife Marta, who'd earlier escaped from detention at the Gurs camp. Bingham hid them both in his house. Learning of Feuchtwanger's plight from Varian Fry, Waitstill and Martha Sharp took it upon themselves to assist his further escape, and on September the 18th, Waitstill volunteered to accompany Feuchtwanger by rail from Marseille to Lisbon. Realizing that Feuchtwanger was still not that safe even in Portugal, Martha Sharp gave up her own berth on the SS Excalibur so he could sail immediately for New York. Marta Feuchtwanger followed some 2 weeks later. Otto Meyerhoff was a Nobel Prize-winning German physician and biochemist. In 1929 he became one of the directors of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Medical Research, a position he held until 1938. But by 1938, even the most patriotic German Jew could sense that there was no future for them under the Nazis. One evening, Meyerhoff prepared an elaborate experiment in his lab as a cover, and the same night took a train to Paris and later to the south of France. Again, with the help of Fry and the Sharps, Meyerhoff and his wife crossed the Pyrenees by foot to arrive in Spain. At the border, the couple were briefly held by Spanish authorities and threatened with deportation before finally being allowed to continue. From Spain, Meyerhoff and his wife travelled to Lisbon, where they boarded the ship SS Executor for the United States on the 16th of October 1940. Back in Marseille, Fry was building a team of loyal supporters, including American painter and sculptor Miriam Davenport, who had herself left Paris looking to escape to the USA. Davenport visited the American consulate to renew her passport and noticed a long queue of refugees waiting to be seen, and the consulate doorman being offensively rude to them. A strong odour of xenophobia and anti-Semitism permeated the premises. Davenport joined Fry at the American Relief Center on August the 27th. She persuaded Fry to bring on other helpers, including a new friend and fellow American, Mary Jane Gold, a wealthy Chicago socialite. Mary Jane Gold was in Paris when France fell in 1940. She fled to Marseille, but instead of returning to the States, helped payroll Fry's operation. She was helped by French foreign legionnaire turned local gangster Raymond Couron, who became her lover. Mary Jane was passionately anti-Nazi. Even her poodle Dagobert would bark furiously whenever anyone muttered Hitler, Hitler. She also subsidized expansion of the rescue mission to include more than just the people on Fry's list, creating what Davenport called the Gold List. Viennese political cartoonist Wilhelm Bill Spira became the main forger for the operation. Spira had fled Austria for Paris in August 1938, where he assumed the more symbolic name of Bill Fryer, meaning more free. Spira eventually ended up in Marseille and met Fry, who learned that he could produce a perfect forgery of the Vichy identity card. Another rescue centre helper was Charles Fawcett. Actor, musician and professional wrestler, Fawcett once gave the consulate doorman a lesson he wouldn't forget. This horrible doorman was given instructions not to let refugees in, and he really meant it. A friend and I took him around the corner one day and worked him over. I had a wrestling hold on him, and when we got around the corner, 3 or 4 of the refugees had followed us and were watching. From then on, he was much nicer. Fawcett lived until 92, and in 3 months at the end of the war, he married 6 Jewish women liberated from concentration camps, a procedure that entitled them to leave France with an automatic American visa. At one point, 2 Mrs. Fawcetts turned up in Lisbon at the same time. In October 1940, Mary Jane Gold and Miriam Davenport stumbled on a large villa on the outskirts of Marseille. Davenport rented the villa Air-Bel, and it soon came to house Fry, Gold and other American Rescue Committee staffers, as well as such luminaries as writers André Breton and Victor Serge and their families. Artist Max Ernst would join them in December 1940, baptized Chateau Esper Visa, Chateau Hoping for Visa by Victor Serge. The Villa Air-Bel became a famous last gathering place and haunt for the refugee surrealist artists who congregated around André Breton. Waiting anxiously for their visas to come through, André Breton, Max Ernst, André Masson and other surrealists whiled away long weeks at the chateau, painting, writing, playing games, and even creating a new card pack. Having deconstructed traditional playing card designs, Breton wanted a thorough reinvention along surrealist principles. The suits were renamed Locks for Knowledge, Wheels for Revolution, Stars for Dreams, and Flames for Love and Desire. The Jeu de Marseille was eventually produced as a full deck of cards. In December 1940, the villa was raided by French police, who detained Fry and his colleagues on a ship in Marseille harbour for several days during a visit by Marshal Pétain. The following month, Fry's American passport expired and the State Department refused to renew it. Fry decided to continue his mission nonetheless. Fry's 1941 émigré clients were André Breton, Claude Lévi-Strauss, André Masson, and Russian author Victor Serge. Serge described the people waiting to emigrate. Here is a beggar's alley gathering the remnants of revolutions, democracies, and crushed intellects. In our ranks are enough doctors, psychologists, engineers, educationalists, poets, painters, writers, musicians, economists, and public men to vitalize a whole great country. As an undocumented Russian with a communist past and with both the Gestapo and the GPU on his tail, Serge was desperate to leave France. André Breton was a French writer, poet, and anti-fascist, best known as the founder of Surrealism. The Vichy government banned his writings as the very negation of the national revolution. On December 3rd, 1940, Breton, who'd been a member of the French Communist Party, was arrested in Marseille and held for 4 days. The official report described him as a dangerous anarchist sought for a long time by the French police. Claude Lévi-Strauss, of Jewish ancestry, was a French anthropologist and ethnologist. He argued that the savage mind had the same structure as the civilized mind and that human characteristics are the same everywhere. Hardly an idea to appeal to the Nazi super race. After the French capitulation in 1940, he was employed at a school in Montpellier, but was then dismissed under the Vichy racial laws and headed for Marseille. Born in France, brought up in Belgium, and an artist from the age of 11, an early surrealist and devotee of Cubism, André Masson's work had also been condemned by the Nazis as degenerate. He was staying in a hunting lodge about an hour's train ride from Villa Air-Bel and Marseille. Fry was to help them all, getting visas for André Masson and his family on the 11th of February and the Bretons on the 6th of March 1941. On the 25th of March 1941, Claude Lévi-Strauss, André, Jacqueline and Aube Breton and Victor Serge and his son Vladi escaped Vichy France aboard the Capitaine Paul Lemel, born from Martinique, en route to the United States. When the ship reached Fort de France in Martinique, Breton was put in a concentration camp by the Vichy authorities who'd been warned about the dangerous agitator. And a week after Breton left France, André Masson followed from Marseille on the Carrimar, also bound for Martinique, which arrived at Fort de France in April. Since it was merely a way station to New York, Breton and Masson were not happy to be in Martinique, but during their time there they collaborated on a small book, Martinique Snake Charmer, one of Surrealism's most important texts. Breton and his wife finally left Martinique on May the 16th, 1941, arriving in New York on the 1st of June on SS Algonquin after a brief stop in the Dominican Republic. Masson and family arrived after a transit stop in the US Virgin Islands a week later. Upon arrival in New York City, US customs officials inspecting Masson's luggage found a cache of his erotic drawings. Denouncing them as pornographic, they destroyed 5 before the artist's eyes. German-born Jewish-American political theorist Hannah Arendt, perhaps the most important female philosopher of the last century, and who'd coined the phrase the banality of evil, was interned in the Gurs camp as an enemy alien in 1940. Like many others, Arendt was able to leave Gurs after a few weeks, and with visas illegally issued by Hiram Bingham, left France in 1941, and left Lisbon for the United States aboard the SS Guinée on May the 10th, 1941 with her husband Blucher. Varian Fry paid for their travel and helped obtain the visas. Marc Chagall, born Moshe Segal in a Lithuanian Jewish family in Belarus in 1887, was another rescued by the Varian Fry operation. He'd been targeted before the war when, during 1937, His and about 20,000 works from German museums were confiscated as degenerate by Goebbels. Although the German press had once swooned over him, the new German authorities now made a mockery of Chagall's art, describing them as green, purple and red Jews shooting out of the earth, fiddling on violins, flying through the air, representing an assault on Western civilization. Chagall needed to get away and headed for France. In 1940, Chagall and his wife Bella lost their naturalized French citizenship and Chagall was briefly arrested. Bella immediately turned to Fry for help and he was able to get him released, but trapped in Vichy France with no exit visas. Fry bought them passage tickets and signed an affidavit certifying to Chagall's moral character and financial independence. Eventually, in May 1941, Marc and wife Bella were able to leave and cross the French-Spanish border. Arriving in Lisbon, they sailed for New York on the Mozinho on the 10th of June and arrived there on the 23rd of June 1941, a day after Germany had invaded the Soviet Union.
Chagall's daughter Ida and her husband Michel followed later with a large case of Chagall's work on the overcrowded refugee ship SS Navamar. Labelled Nevermore by its benighted passengers, it left Seville on the 6th of August 1941 with over 1,000 Jewish refugees. It called at Lisbon, in Havana in Cuba, and eventually reached New York on the 12th of September 1941. During the 48-day voyage, many of the passengers contracted typhus and 6 of them died at sea, a 7th upon arrival.
With the Nazi occupation of France, Jewish Lithuanian Cubist sculptor Jacques Lipchitz also had to flee Paris. With the assistance of Fry, he too escaped and came to the USA with his wife Bertha in spring 1941. His 1938 sculpture, The Myth of the Rape of Europa, compares the violent elements of the myth to the Holocaust. But when he took up the subject again in America in 1941, this time with Europa stabbing the bull, Europa symbolizes Europe, while the bull represents Hitler.
The rescues continued. German painter, sculptor, graphic artist and poet Max Ernst was a pioneer of Dada and Surrealism. In September 1939, he was interned as an undesirable foreigner in the Camp Les Milles. Thanks to friends, including Fry, he was released a few weeks later and his escape planned. He nearly didn't make it. What happened at the border on the 1st of July 1941 was later described as follows. Despite a very official-looking forged document, the tall, aquiline artist found himself stopped at the border by a suspicious customs officer who demanded to know what he had rolled up under his arm. So took place the exhibition of his life, with the unrolling of those wild and sumptuous canvases that, in what seemed like a few minutes, got tacked to peeling walls of the dreary little station. Travellers looked and marvelled. There before them were the forests and their glistening basilisks, the green eyes of rampant nature that stared down the officious customs inspector. He gazes, walks away and back again. In the general commotion he's made a decision. He plants himself before Max and his voice must have trembled slightly. Monsieur, I adore talent. You have a great talent. But I must send you back to Pau in France. There is the train for Pau. Here on the left is the train for Madrid. Here is your passport. Don't take the wrong train. And so, in a truly surreal moment, Max Ernst crossed into Spain, eventually getting to New York on a Pan Am flying boat, all expenses paid by Peggy Guggenheim, who'd fallen in love with him. Back in Marseille, Vichy France lodged protests with the American consul about Fry's activities, and the police often raided Fry's offices in search of incriminating documents. The French wanted him gone, as did US diplomats in Vichy France who felt that Fry's methods were hurting the good relations existing between the US and Vichy France. Fry was continuously followed by French secret agents and finally on the 29th of August 1941 was arrested, given an hour to pack, driven to the Spanish border and told that his expulsion had been ordered by the Ministry of the Interior with the approval of the American Embassy. Ironically, Fry's passport had expired and it took the authorities a further week to throw him out on September the 6th. By the time he was expelled, Fry had spent 13 months in the country and by May 1941 his office had handled more than 15,000 requests, of which 1,800 fell within the scope of his direct work.
Altogether, 1,500 were sent out of the country and support and allowances distributed to 2,500 others. In October 1941, Jewish emigration from Germany and German-held lands was banned and mass deportations of German Jews to the east began. On the 1st of November 1941, Fry boarded a Yankee clipper in Lisbon and flew back to the USA. On the 7th of December, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. After his departure, Fry's office continued to function, headed by his French aide Daniel Benedict, until it was closed by the authorities on the 2nd of June 1942. March 1942 also saw the Artists in Exile exhibition at the Pierre Matisse Gallery in New York. Pierre Matisse, son of the painter, displayed one work by each of 14 artists who had fled the war in Europe, half with the help of the Emergency Rescue Committee. 5 of the men in this picture were saved by Fry. This is the signed copy of the catalogue and the painting The Seeded Earth, 1942, by André Masson. After his forced return to the United States, Varian Fry was watched by the FBI. His courage and heroism were ignored during his lifetime, and for the rest of his life he was avoided by his former colleagues and made a living as a Latin teacher in a boys' school. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage and was found dead in his bed on September the 13th, 1967, by the Connecticut State Police. He was buried at Greenwood Cemetery, Brooklyn, alongside his parents. The French were more supportive, and shortly before his death, the French government awarded him the Cross of a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor, the highest French order of merit. Streets are named after him in France, Germany, and New Jersey. In 1994, he was the first American to be recognized by Yad Vashem as one of the righteous among the nations. In 1941, Varian Fry had written to his wife, "Among the people who have come into my office, or with whom I am in constant correspondence, are not only some of the greatest living authors, painters, sculptors of Europe, but also former cabinet ministers and even prime ministers of half a dozen countries." What a strange place Europe is when men like this are reduced to waiting patiently in the anteroom of a young American of no importance whatever.